have their key.
Canopy red oak. So you guys did not take dogwood from this one last year? I was attracted to science and ecology in general because I was interested in forests, why forests are where they are, why some forests grow faster, or why some forests have different composition of species than other forests. Did we do 150, 100? We can collect a lot of information on the ground about the effects of environmental change on species composition and other environmental factors. And it can tell you a lot about a single space, but it doesn't tell you a lot about a large area. In order to study the larger landscape, you need tools that will help you to extrapolate those point measurements across a larger area. Everybody loves great vistas. Everybody loves to go and look out over landscapes, to be at the top of a mountain, to be on a lookout tower and look over an area. That is usually the pinnacle of somebody's trip. When you go on a trip to a national park, you look for the vista, for the great views. Well, that's really what remote sensing is. It's coming from space, and it allows you to look at large areas and get a great picture of what an area looks like remotely without actually having to be there. Remotely sensed data are generally collected from either an airplane or a satellite above the surface of the Earth that have something similar to a camera on them that allows them to make an image of the electromagnetic radiation that is reflected or emitted from the area on the Earth beneath the satellite or the airplane. Instruments such as Landsat measure broad bands of the electromagnetic spectrum and are useful for measuring broad characteristics of the land surface: forest, water, agriculture. Instruments such as hyperspectral devices measure very narrow bands of the electromagnetic spectrum and can get at much finer distinctions of surface properties. For example, you can use hyperspectral remote sensing to measure the chemistry of the surface that you are sampling. Some sensors measure very large areas, but with a low amount of information over those areas, whereas other sensors measure much smaller areas but have much more detail about that area. Find the magnifying glass and draw a box. Remote sensing is a wonderful visualization tool. You can tell people about changes that may be occurring, but when they actually see it with their eyes, they see pictures that show changes in the distribution of forest or the expansion of road networks in cities. It gives you a lot of information that people can take in visually and really understand. Remote sensing can also be an important source of data for analyses. We use remote sensing to measure the size of the hole in the ozone layer. We use remote sensing to measure the distribution of polar ice caps. We've used remote sensing for mapping weather and features of the weather, such as hurricanes are probably the most common use of remote sensing. Remote sensing is also used to measure sea surface profiles that tell us a little bit about the temperature of the sea surface and can tell us other important climatic factors, such as whether an El Nino event is occurring. We want to know how far we can push remote sensing. Can we use remote sensing to get very detailed information about the canopy composition of a forest? Can we use remote sensing to measure the chemistry of a forest? This requires collecting a lot of data about composition, measuring the forest, taking hemispherical photographs of the forest canopy to understand the gappiness of the forest, for example. We also collect leaf samples, which we take back to the lab and analyze chemically to determine exactly what their chemical composition is. Well, I've got understory red oak. Right, this one is from the canopy and this one's from the understory. Okay, another understory and another canopy. And once we've accumulated all of this data, we can begin to interpret the images that we've collected. Does a high reflectance that is measured by the satellite, a bright area on a satellite image, relate to, say, having a high amount of biomass or a high amount of a certain type of chemical component in the forest? The mid-slopes are generally leafed out, but the tops and bottoms of the slope aren't. The tops aren't because they're exposed and colder, and the bottoms aren't because they've got the cold air. we're looking for those types of relationships, correlations between the ground measurements and the intensities on the satellite images to see if we can then use that information to map what we're interested in. We're using remote sensing to map the distribution of defoliation by gypsy moths in the oak forests of the Appalachian Mountains. We assess gypsy moth defoliation basically two ways. We can take photographs of the canopy from beneath the canopy and watch over the course of a season the effects of defoliation, from having leaves that are entire to leaves that are gradually eaten. We can also set up collectors, such as those you see behind you here, to collect gypsy moth frass. And this can give us a measure of how active the gypsy moths actually are in the forest. These on-the-ground measurements are only for single points. We're interested in looking at defoliation over large areas, and we can use remote sensing to detect the extent of areas that are affected by gypsy moths. Geographic Information Systems are another important tool that scientists use to convey information about large areas. GIS includes both spatial data, XY coordinates, locations, and tabular information about what those features are at those different coordinates. XY coordinate information and the attributes that go along with those don't mean very much when you look at them in a table, but when you look at a map that has those coordinates plotted out and the information that's associated with those also shown, you can really get a good overview and a quick picture of what's going on. GIS wouldn't be necessary if we just wanted to look at one feature, one map. But if you're looking at different maps, or if you're trying to accumulate a lot of different information about an area, GIS is what allows you to merge all that information together. We can use the GIS to understand what the topography of an area looks like. We use what are known as digital elevation models, or DEMs, which are representations of what the slope and the elevation and what a surface looks like. GIS is used to map migration patterns of birds. GIS is used for economic planning, for looking at trends in housing and population. GIS is used for geologic mapping. GIS is used in almost any type of endeavor that is interested in locating something somewhere. We collect information about forest composition using our ground data and using remote sensing data. But in order to understand why different types of forests are located where they are, we need to use a geographic information system. We use global positioning systems, or GPS, to map the locations of our sites on the ground.
Tracking 3 satellites with a PDOP of 13.
We take the GPS coordinates measured on the ground, we input them into the geographic information systems. What we do with the GIS is that we collect information about terrain, about the topography, about soils, and about geology, and about weather and climate that allows us to test hypotheses about what is controlling the distribution of a certain species of oak or pine. Another way we're using GIS is to try and predict the area that would be flooded at different flow rates or discharge rates on the Roanoke River in North Carolina. We've mapped actual flooding at known discharge rates using radar remote sensing, but we don't know anything about the conditions that occur between different flow levels for which we haven't used remote sensing to measure the flood area. We take the maps from different flow rates and we extrapolate between the areas that are flooded at those different rates to predict for a rate that we don't have a map from. This can be used for planning so that we know at a specific discharge rate or under a specific set of conditions what area is likely to be flooded. When you're in the forest, you see one thing. You can see the trees, you have a very tactile understanding of what's going on in the forest and what the forest looks like. Remote sensing and GIS give you the opportunity to stand back and to get the big picture, to get a view of what a whole landscape looks like, to see the forest for the trees, really. And that's exciting to be able to look on one hand at one scale at the forest from the ground, and then to look at its context in the bigger picture. That's why it's so exciting.